frankly speaking, this is our first ever actual interview in person. As you've seen, we've done some live streams, but today I'm interviewing Professor James Tooley, or would it be Vice Chancellor? What would you prefer?
Well, I'm Professor James Tooley, but my job title is Vice Chancellor.
So Professor James Tooley, Vice Chancellor here at Buckingham University, and he's an expert in education. I'd say, as far as experts go, a genuine expert, not one of these experts you'd find at Sage, who, well, let's just say in football terms have a worse record than Alan Pardew. So, I mean, James, tell us about yourself. I know a lot about you, but a lot of my listeners don't.
Okay. So I am Vice Chancellor at the University of Buckingham, which is known to be Britain's premier private or independent university. We're very proud of that whole background of independence. So we can talk about that as we go along.
I did notice when we were walking around the decking was cleaned, which to me was a sign of a good university, because at mine it wasn't.
All right. So we're proudly independent. You know, we were formed nearly 50 years ago, and the person who gave the first matriculation address, February the 5th, 1976, was Margaret Thatcher. You know, and so she was involved right from the beginning. We got our Royal Charter in 1983 under Margaret Thatcher's premiership, and when she resigned from politics, she became our Chancellor. You know, the Chancellor is the figurehead, the Vice Chancellor is the CEO, if you like, but the Chancellor is the figurehead. She was our Chancellor from 92 to 99. So there's a close involvement with that sort of person, that sort of tradition. But we're here, we're proudly independent. But you asked about me. I've been in this role for 10 months tomorrow as Vice Chancellor. And before that, I was Pro-Vice Chancellor here. Before that, just a professor. Been here 2 years. Then I was 20 years at Newcastle University up north. Before that, Manchester, Oxford, UCL, London. And my work, particularly over those 20 years at Newcastle University, my work was all about this incredible phenomenon of low-cost private education. I discovered it. I just discovered it for people in England, for America. No one had any idea that in the poorest slums in the world, parents were abandoning the state schools. There were state schools available typically. They said their children are abandoned in the state schools. And they were sending their children to private schools set up typically by local entrepreneurs who created an amazing alternative. I found this 20 odd years ago in the slums of Hyderabad in south central India. And it changed my life, because I've become an expert. You used that word expert just now. I've become an expert on private education. Everyone knew private education is about the rich, the elite. I didn't want my work to be about the rich and the elite, because for whatever reason I was concerned about the poor. This sort of was an epiphany for me. Private schools for the poor. And I dedicated 20 years of my life to working in that field, doing research, doing developments. I created a few chains of these low-cost private schools, several federations. The one of which I'm most proud of at the moment is AFED in Nigeria, the Association of Formidable Education Development, a wonderful Nigerian name, with 5,000 school members, nearly 1 million kids. And that's where I've been working. And I've come here now to consolidate some of that work, but also to see how these principles of independence, autonomy, they can also be here in the university sector too.
Very interesting. Because I know a lot about your work already, but I find it fascinating, because I've been in both sides of the education sector. I think my school actually was, I can't remember if it was Times or the Telegraph, top 10 value for money in the country, which they were really proud of.
This was a private school?
Yes, it was Filing Hall in North Yorkshire, okay. Which was either...
I figured you were a Yorkshireman, yeah.
Best county in the world.
Yeah.
And it was either military kids,
Yeah.
because the military would pay 80 or 90%, it varied, or Cantonese students, or we had a couple of Germans and Poles, but by and large it was, if you were British, you weren't from what people would think are private school families.
No.
Because quite often when I talk to people, and I think if I did a poll now, if I said to people, when you think of private schools, what do you think? They'll probably say Hogwarts.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing you know the school called Ampleforth. It's one of the best private schools in the country. I remember we used to play them at rugby and it looked like Hogwarts.
Yeah.
So I've done the side of private education, where I've then at 16 I left to go into a state sixth form. And the massive difference I noticed, it wasn't the curriculum, because they often say, oh, they get taught better stuff. No, we were on like the same curriculum, you know. We used the same exam boards. Obviously, it's different exam boards, but like we used the same as you did. But the main difference I noticed was that we were taught how to think and how to find the solutions to problems ourselves, rather than when I went to state school, it was, here's the curriculum, here's the questions, here's the answers, go.
Right.
And they're all of, oh, what about this? There was no time for the answer. You get the odd teacher that would delve into other things, but by and large it was a case of, no, this is the curriculum, just do this to get your grade.
Yeah. And I wouldn't want to say that is the difference between private and public, or private and state as we call it here. So, you know, your experience is interesting. You know, I'm interested in evidence of what's happening in many different places. And you can, you know, the beauty to me of the private sector, or one of the beauties, is that it can accommodate a multitude of approaches, depending on parental preferences, depending on student preferences, and so on and so forth. So it's not a rigid focus, this is what the private education system is like. Actually, the private education system can let 100 flowers bloom, to coin a phrase. That's a real advantage. And you know, you actually mentioned, which some people might be interested in. I also, you mentioned you saw both systems. I was a state school child. You know, I went through one of the early comprehensive schools. Actually, probably it was signed off by Margaret Thatcher when she was Secretary for Education under the Heath government in the early 70s. And, you know, we all have experiences at school which make us think, I don't want kids to go through that. That was my experience of the comprehensive system. It was not necessarily a great experience. But that's important sometimes for your listeners to know that I've come from privilege and I'm just wanting to promote privilege. Actually, I came from a relatively working class background. Here we went to state schools, and the work I'm doing is not about privilege within the slums of Nigeria, Liberia, South Sudan. It's about finding parental preference driving this desire for accountability, another real virtue of the private sector. And just on your point, you know, what's the differences between private and public? I've done considerable work, and others have done considerable work in this area as well, doing proper research, looking at differences in achievement between children in private schools and public schools, all in poor areas of Nigeria, India, Ghana, Uganda, and so on. And the results are not surprising to me, perhaps not to you, but the results are very clear that children in the low-cost private schools do much, much better than the children in the state schools after doing all the proper statistical controls. So, you know, they are better at certain things, and clearly they're better as far as parents are concerned. They're safer, they are fit in with their aspirations,
I think one of the things most people would find surprising there is the fact that you had low cost and private in the same...
Yes.
Because it's become a bit of a dirty word, hasn't it? Private. So when people say, oh, trying to privatise the NHS or private healthcare or private education, it's always like that is just for a specific 1% of society. Well, actually, no. I've found, so it's one of the reasons why I've always been quite conservative. Like I never had a left wing phase.
All right.
From a young teen, I was always quite interested in conservatism.
Yeah.
Because I saw the whole idea of, you know, at least I say true conservatism with free markets and small state, that it allowed people to go as far as they're willing to take themselves.
Yeah.
And when things like such with private healthcare, you can get the whole, if everyone kind of went a private route, you get the competition from those selling. Oh, interrupt for tea, that's fine. Happy to interrupt for that. Oh, hi. Didn't see you there. I'm Callum Smiles. You may recognise me from COVID vaccines aren't the answer, convince me otherwise. Soon we'll be doing another one where it says no child should receive the COVID vaccine, convince me otherwise. Make sure you check this out if you haven't already, and watch out for that one. See, as I was saying before we got a welcome interruption with tea, the whole idea of privatising things, it allows competition, which actually, a lot of people think private just means expensive, where actually private can drive prices down, and you let the invisible hand of the market dictate things.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of very important points you made there. I mean, just again, I think you like a little bit of autobiography. You said you never went through a left-wing phase. I very much did go through a left-wing phase, you know. And my first job after university, I went to Sussex University, which was known as a sort of left-wing university at that time. And my first job was as a mathematics teacher in Zimbabwe in the early 80s. And that was really to help build this Marxist-Leninist regime of Comrade Mugabe there. And so I went through that phase, and, you know, and several very famous people have been through that phase. Hayek went through a similar phase. And it was empirically, because to me, there is something very attractive about the idea of, you know, this person's poor, you're rich, well, let's take some of your money and give it to them, you know. As an abstract argument for a young person, that seems fine. What you've got to realise then is there's lots of disincentives to you. There's lots of moral hazard for that person there who take the money to it, and there's lots of problems giving the state power to do that. But it's an empirical thing for me, that actually realising that doesn't work, and in the case of education, it clearly doesn't work. The public schools, the state schools, we've got to get our vocabulary right. Most of the world uses public to describe the state system.
Where does that come from, very quickly, because you think public, state, like everyone.
It's a long answer. Sorry. There should be a long answer. I'll give you a quick one.
Yeah.
And when those schools, the great, what we call the great public schools here, Eton, Harrow, and those, they were founded, you know, hundreds of years ago, to provide an education for the public, as opposed to the elite who would have, you know, tutors at home and so on, and they were open, of course, to a wider public than just the elite. And now we've got this strange thing when it's actually Great Britain uses this terminology, so does India. The public schools in India are also the elite private schools. Everywhere else doesn't use it, so just to make sure absolutely clear, we will use the word state schools to mean what many in the world call public schools, and in England we will use the term private schools to signify those that are not run by the state or not.
So it's all a bit like which side of the road you drive on in your country.
It is a bit like that, actually. Yes, good. Actually, very good analogy. Yes. So it's just a convention with the terminology. You were saying privatization is a dirty word. Well, it's thrown at our side as if it's a dirty word, and, you know, people on the opposing side can take the moral high ground sometimes. But for me, private, independent, these things are incredibly valuable. They're about, you mentioned, I think, agency, about people being able to do what, you know, make the most of their lives and so on. For me, private is very much about agency and self-help, but also community self-help. And then you started saying that low-cost things is confusing to people. That's been the basis of my work overseas, and I also started this low-cost private school, relatively low-cost, up north in Durham, which if you want to, we can talk about.
Yeah, I would like to get there eventually. But yeah, so have you worked much in schools, or rather is it like state schools in the country, in the UK, or has it been mainly university level?
So in the UK, I've done very little work in state schools. I did some work in state schools on mathematics education, but as a sort of someone coming outside, helping to improve mathematics education in state schools. But no, I went into university and I've been studying and researching, as it were, schools, primary and secondary level schools, but not working in the state sector in this country, no.
Because I mean, again, from my experience, and I wouldn't want you to incriminate your own employer, but I find that by and large at university level in the UK now, and I've seen bits in America, the whole idea of a university, which I think at least it initially was, I believe was a place to harness critical thinking, whereas now it's almost a place to make people critical of thinking. So you get given an opinion, and it's like, I remember when I was at university, we had an election. I'm quite conservative, so obviously I voted Conservative. I remember we went into rehearsals the day after, and so I was like, "Just don't say anything." I went, "No, I don't have to. The sky's blue, the country's blue, the winners don't have to gloat." But I found that they didn't understand why, because they were in this community which was more of an echo chamber where they were just told they're bad,
Yeah.
this is bad.
I mean, this is a very wider problem, and it's in a sense disconnected with my other work. But now, as a university vice chancellor, I'm very much aware of the problem of academic freedom and free speech on campuses, and what you're sort of indicating is perhaps the sort of what the terminology is a woke culture has pervaded universities, and students take it on unthinkingly. I mean, it's not necessarily a new phenomenon. When I was at Sussex University, whatever it was, 40 odd years ago, most students were left-wing, and in the language of today, they probably would be called woke, and in the language of yesteryear, they'd probably be called politically correct. So it's not a particularly new phenomenon. What has changed is the extent of the political affiliation on the left as far as academics is concerned. That's grown massively over that time. So whereas before there would have been a more equal, I think the left probably always dominated, but there would be enough sort of academics who identified with conservatism or the right. Now we are a small minority, but it's very important to me, and I'm speaking at a conference tomorrow in London, organised by the Academy of Ideas, who are actually also affiliated here, about academic freedom and so on. And I don't have any tolerance for that sort of intolerance. We've got to have all ideas coming out. The university should be about the quest for truth and the freedom to pursue the truth.
Don't tell Sage that.
That's what it should be about. And at Buckingham, I'm very glad that we were always top in the free speech, academic freedom rankings that were done by various organisations, and I'm very proud of that tradition.
Would you say because obviously you've been in education a lot longer than I have, would you say from when you started up until now there has been a growing suppression of free speech at universities that you've done work at? Or at least research?
So yeah, and you asked the question sort of anecdotally. It certainly felt that way, and I think the data would support it. But there's been this sort of move now for the cancel culture, the cancelling, the stopping of speakers come to talk. Now that's, people say, oh, but it's a very small number of talks have been cancelled, speakers have been cancelled. That's true, it is a small number, but what has happened is that then brings a culture where people like you or me in a university would then be afraid to invite that sort of person because we know it leads to trouble, or indeed would be afraid to pursue certain areas because we know we're not really allowed to do those, they're beyond the pale. And obviously some areas that are illegal, we obviously can't be looking at those. Some we don't want to be deliberately offensive in anything, but nonetheless academic freedom is really important.
I do find that we have a lot of people now that, because I get messages in our account where people will ask me like, how do you approach things, because I just don't know how to. I'm really not comfortable at doing that, because I'd say we're no longer taught how to debate. We did a bit at my school, but I find that a lot of people, we quickly go into this slagging match because we don't know how to like, okay, they've got a different opinion to me. I'm going to question that. So we did, we've only done one so far, but we've done public debates where, I don't know if you ever heard of a man called Stephen Crowder in America. So he does a thing called Change My Mind. He puts out his belief and he invites people to come and sit down and try and change his mind. We've put a bit of a British spin on it called Convince Me Otherwise. Yeah. But so we went into Salisbury and, I don't know where you stand on it, and your belief is your belief, but I personally don't think vaccines are the answer in terms of the current situation we're in. So what I put out the topic, COVID vaccines aren't the answer, convince me otherwise. And I was polite the entire time, I was smart, I was welcoming people, but quite often I just got this hostile response. And I try and invite people to come and talk, and some people did, but it would just be a case of, no, you are the enemy. You are the enemy. I shouldn't listen to you.
And that was live. That wasn't on social media.
We recorded. We did a little bit live. We also did a recording.
So I think social media is possibly implicated here. Now, in your big introductory remarks, you said I'm an expert, and you introduced me in that way, and I was very pleased. I am an expert in private education, low-cost private education around the world. In these areas, I'm not an expert. Okay, so you're asking me questions which I'm going to give you my opinions and so on, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert in these areas at all. But I think social media is greatly implicated here, or anti-social media, as one might say. And for whatever reason, Twitter or other forms or other platforms, they, for whatever reason, and we can explore, we can think of the reasons, but they encourage this sort of aggression. They encourage this linking in with your own people who have your own beliefs rather than others, and then just attacking others rather than having this engaged debate. I really like what you've described. Convince me otherwise, persuade me. That should be the way we do these things. Give me the facts, give me the figures, give me your values. If your values are different from my values, then maybe we'll never be able to arrive at a thing, But it's often the case that our values, with our opponents are very similar, but we marshal different facts, we marshal different evidence, and then with that, we then come to different conclusions. And it may be a case that people haven't seen the evidence that you've seen, or they don't rank it as equally as important. In the case of the vaccination debate, I'm sure there's evidence on this side about, the effectiveness of vaccines in curing a particular disease, COVID, I'm sure in this case, and they can marshal those facts. You've marshalled the facts to point to some of the problems, and the fact that about that vaccination, we don't know what the long-term impacts are. Now, equally, based in facts, based in values that we want, presumably want a healthy, flourishing population, the values are the same, our facts are different, but they might even acknowledge that both those sets of facts exist, but they will weight one higher than another. And then you can't be convinced, but at least we had a discussion and we realised, you're weighting those facts higher than those facts.
The discussions I really struggled to have were when, so obviously I trained to be an actor, and the worst thing when you're doing improv is when someone says no, because there's nowhere to go with that. But so when people, you go, you're a conspiracy theorist, you go, why am I? You just You've shut me down there without giving me. Why am I a conspiracy? What has led you to believe that I'm a conspiracy theorist? Because you've not given me something to maybe change my mind with, or to rebuttal. But I suppose to link this back to education. I've seen free speech leaving schools. I'd say maybe even used to be a left-wing thing, the whole idea of free speech. But since I've seen schools move more towards a left-wing place, I suppose you could say, it's leaving our education, I'd say facilities, but I mean the whole sector of education, it's gone. And I struggle to see it coming back in the near future. Do you think that is something that almost could make a comeback? The whole idea of free and open debates.
Yeah. So a couple of straws in the wind there to throw out. So one is obviously the current government, for whatever reason, is pushing through this higher education academic free speech bill in Parliament as we speak, and although I'm not particularly in favour in giving the state more power. If they're going to do it, we can make it better. That could have positive impacts. Not everything governments do has negative impacts. So it could have a positive impact in empowering people like yourself, if you're in a university setting, that you can actually, you feel government will protect you rather than leave you to the wolves of your establishment. So that's one positive thing. But second is, we are talking about it more, and a university like Buckingham can actually see it as an opportunity and say, well, we are a free speech university. We believe in academic freedom, and therefore, if you value those things, come to us, whether it's for a course or for a lecture or a seminar, and slowly people will see, well, Buckingham is doing well in that way. Why don't we emulate it? And so that, in a sense, it's a market, spontaneous order response. Things are happening over there where we can make an effective counter-response.
Let the invisible hand of the market dictate.
Yeah, it's the invisible hand or spontaneous order, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, so I'm not pessimistic like you are. I absolutely refuse to be pessimistic. Truth, freedom will win here. There are forces against us, but we will win.
And they're quite determined.
I'm equally as determined.
So I'd like to talk to you a bit about your educational research in, I would say, the third world. Is that the way you could put it? Or?
Yeah, I mean these titles. There's no good title, isn't there? Third world. That was actually, is in a sense, it's now anachronistic because it was defined as the first world was the West, the second world was the Soviet bloc.
That is a thing I've always wondered. Where's number two? Where we go straight from first to third
world were the poorer countries. So there's no suitable title. Developing countries is insipid. We're developed, they're developing. Okay, or some people talk about the global South and the global North, which is at least has the benefit of being obscure, but most of the country, or many of the countries that are supposedly the global South, are actually in the northern hemisphere. India, for example, little known fact, in the northern hemisphere. There's no good term. Anyway, whatever we call it, that's usually rather an anodyne.
Yeah.
Developing countries. So my research there, you want to ask about that? Yeah.
Why? what made you go as far as each corner of the globe?
It's these things are strange, aren't they? Some people like to travel. One of the reviewers of my book, The Beautiful Tree, which was the sort of first book-length treatment of this whole low-cost private education, one of the reviewers of the book said, I suffered from a severe dose of wanderlust. And yeah, for whatever reason, I've just always loved travelling. I've always loved being in different places, but particularly in Africa and South Asia. I just loved those places. So I think I told you my first job was in Zimbabwe as a young man, and that sort of got me excited about Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And I became an expert on private education through my PhD, and then there was there was the International Finance Corporation, which was the private arm of the World Bank. They wanted to look at private education across the developing world. And I managed to win that grant when I was at the University of Manchester. And we looked across a dozen countries, I think, across the developing world. And I got excited about that sort of travel, but these universities and schools were all about the elite, or the upper middle classes at least. And then it was on, when I was doing some consultancy for the IFC, trying to help them get investment into elite universities, private universities in Hyderabad, India, that on a day off I went into the slums of Hyderabad and found this phenomenon. And as I said, that sort of squared the circle for me. Finally there was something about private education in the poorest slums in the world, where I could bring my expertise, but also be helping the poor. So whatever reason, deep psychological reasons maybe, I've always wanted to be involved in that sort of mission, serving those who are less blessed than me. And the poorest people in the world are found in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. That's just the fact of the matter. So that's where I got to. Lots of compensations, being in those places. It's very exciting, It can be quite dangerous, I always seem to be attracted to dangerous places and countries. So I've worked in northern Nigeria, in South Sudan, in Somalia, Liberia, Sierra Leone too. And there was a frisson for me about that.
So when you say low cost, just how cheap what was the cheapest you found?
Yeah, so when I first found these schools 20 years ago, or 20 odd years ago, they were charging fees of about equivalent of $1 a month, US dollar a month. Inflation and so on has taken over. But typical fees might be between $5 to $15 US dollars a month, that sort of thing. So think about £100 a year. That's not a bad sort of a thing to hang this on. It could be £200 a year, but very cheap. Now, very low cost. That sounds incredibly low cost to you and me. To families who are very poor, it's actually quite a substantial cost. But it's not too substantial that they can't afford it. And I've done work and I've published papers on the affordability of low-cost private schools and shown that for a family, for an average-sized family on the poverty line in countries like Liberia, South Sudan and so on, there are schools, low-cost schools available to them where they have to pay the school fees for all of their family. The school fees will be 10% of their income, which is affordable. So it's very important to note that they are affordable for the poor, but they are incredibly low cost as far as we're concerned. Also, it's very important to realise that government schools, state schools, are not free in the sort of countries I'm dealing with. Now, they may ostensibly have no fees, and the private schools do have these low fees. Often the government schools will have some sort of levy, a development levy, a teacher levy, or something. Sometimes it can even be an official bribery payment. But for a poor parent, when you're weighing up these two options, government school or low-cost private school, this one has fees, the low-cost private school has fees, the government school doesn't have fees, but you still need to buy shoes, you still need to buy a uniform, you still need to buy books, you still need to have funds for transport. And again, our research has shown that the cost to a poor parent of sending a child to a government school is 75% of the cost to a parent of sending to a low-cost private school. 75%. So it is more expensive to a low-cost private school, but it's not in a completely different league, if you're understanding me. The government school is certainly not free. Very important to realise.
And also, it comes out of taxes as well, so it's never free, which a lot of people seem to...
Yeah, but the poor may not be paying much tax. There may be tax on, drink or some food, but often there are ways around that anyway. So, for the poor parents, there may not be a big tax burden. There may not be.
So with these poor low cost private schools. How small were they at times? Were they?
Yeah, I mean, actually, in some countries, and you know, as the market matures, they're not particularly. I mean, they're not. It's not a feature that you would pick out necessarily. I mean, some could be incredibly small. A new school might only have 10 students as it develops, but I think the average size of schools in studies I've looked at, you know, might be 100, 200, 300, that sort of thing, which is not particularly small. But that's an average size. There would be schools of 1,000 or more.
And were there clear results in that local area once they'd leave these schools? Like did you ever notice that in these areas where there were the low cost private schools, did the community better as a result over time?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and this is so I haven't got evidence on this. I've got anecdotes on this, and the issue there is, you know, if you live in the poor slums, I mean, they're not particularly pleasant places to live necessarily. And so if you are educated and you can get out of those places, you probably do. But then you can bring funds to your family or your extended family or friends that are left there. So typically these, you know, but you know, this is an anecdote, and these places have developed for many reasons. But you know, so some of the poor slums that I worked in 20 years ago, 10 years ago in India are no longer poor. You know, they've now completely grown, and it's not just through gentrification of the different people coming in, although that does happen, but it's often the people within those communities getting richer. It must be partly through the education of them or their children who are bringing my funds back. But that's anecdote. It must have some impact.
You'd like to think so, I mean.
Yeah, it must do. It's partly, you know, parents wouldn't scrimp and save. You know, these sums of money are small to us, remember, they're a lot to a poor parent. They wouldn't scrimp and save in order to pay those fees unless they had seen or could see some benefit, and typically those benefits emerge.
Just how bad were some of the state schools that you've come across?
Yeah, and I preface this with what I say. I'm never condemning individual state school teachers, and there are some wonderful teachers within the state schools. There's some brilliant head teachers, you know, and some great administrators, you know. So I'm not condemning any individuals. I mean, I'm not condemning individuals in general. The system was wonky. I mean, the very first time, so I was working in the poor parts of Hyderabad 20 years ago, and I was working in these low-cost schools and seeing the energetic teaching, talking to parents who were saying, the schools are accountable to me, you know. Talking to the parents and saying, our children in the government schools are abandoned. And so I went to see one of these schools once, and in my first time looking there, and the building was nice. The building was much better than the buildings the private schools were in. But I think the schools had supposed to have 7 teachers present. There were only 2 teachers present. The children were all crammed into 2 classes, 130 beautiful kids, eager to learn, sitting on the floor amongst the mosquitoes, doing nothing, because the 7 teachers had an informal rota that a couple of teachers had to come in each day, keep things under check, and but not do any work with the kids. You know, broke my heart. Really broke my heart, and I've seen so much of similar things across different countries. I remember going to state schools in Nigeria, in Lagos, and again I'd been working in the slum called Makoko, which is this shanty town built on stilts into the dark waters of the Lagos lagoon, and went to visit the state schools on the outskirts of that slum, and there were 3 schools on the same site, you know. Very convenient for the administrators, but not very convenient for the parents, who had to travel a long way to come to this big site. And there was just a general air of indifference. The teachers were sitting, drinking tea, eating peanuts, getting the children to do work for them, typically giving a child the task of teaching the rest of the class. And often there'll be corporal punishment, severe corporal punishment you see. So, that's not true of every school. There'll be some good state schools, the headmasters manage to get this going, but it's an uphill struggle.
I was about to say, in my private school, we carried wood up to the staff room. I think they were doing this in private schools as well, having us do work for them. But character building.
Yeah.
So,
but that was not instead of studies.
Yeah, no. It was usually because we buggered up, but
Yeah.
but no, it was good. It was I put a lot of my values down to private education.
Please take a moment to like and subscribe the Frankly Speaking podcast and drop us a comment below to let us know what you would like to see in the future.
So to finish off with, I'd like to talk to you about your independent grammar schools that you created. Do you want to take all the credit? Or
No. Okay. So my work was always in developing countries, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, mostly West Africa actually.
I mean, as someone who's grown up in the northeast, they are developing country.
No. I'm not making that analogy. No, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
No, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, but also other parts of the world, Central and South America too. And I would come and give talks at conferences about this extraordinary phenomenon of low-cost private schools. Incidentally, we haven't mentioned the figures of the numbers of children going to these schools. In urban areas and across sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, East Africa, 75-80% of kids are in these low-cost private schools. I should have mentioned that earlier. And the same figure in urban India. This is a massive phenomenon. Probably 450,000 of these schools.
Is that a figure that's grown over recent years?
Or has grown, yes, it has. We've seen it grow as well. And in rural India, there's a great study, ASA, the Annual Status of Education Report. They catalogue this figure growing. When I first started, it was probably near 20% in rural areas going to private schools. It's now well over 30%. So you see this phenomenon. It's massive. 450,000 schools like this in India.
Blimey.
14,000 in Lagos State, Nigeria alone. Massive. Okay, so I would come back and give this evidence to conferences, talk about this ubiquity of private education, and there'd always be some bright spark in the audience say, oh, why isn't this happening in England? Why isn't this happening in America, if I was talking in America? And I would always have to say, well, maybe there's no demand, or maybe we're so used to the state being involved. State schools are not as bad as the schools we see in Lagos or Hyderabad. They're a lot better. Or maybe the regulations would be too heavy. I don't know. So I wasn't able to give an answer, really. And then a few years back, I think I wasn't able to travel for various reasons. It was actually for 6 months or so I wasn't travelling. And, at those days, I was just a one-trick pony, private education, low-cost private education. So I decided to take my team from Newcastle out on the street to ask people, is there any demand for private education amongst, a different market? We know there's private education for the upper quintile of wealth and income in this country can afford private schools, and then there are exceptions like you and from an army family, but the vast majority of people cannot afford it. As an academic, there's no way I could afford private education.
It was actually cheaper with the army money to have me and my brothers at school than it was to have us home.
Yeah.
It was actually...
But that's very unusual.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just explore this, and I'd ask the question on the sort of... Absolutely, I wasn't comparing them with Lagos or India. But, asking communities, people, do you want to send your child to private school? Yes. Why don't you? Duh. It's too expensive. It's that very simple thing. If it was £50 a week, would you be able to afford it? Yeah, possibly could. £60? Yeah, possibly could. Not everyone, but enough people said that. So therefore, with colleagues, so I got together with, so it's my idea with two other colleagues. One was a retired principal, or about to retire, principal of a private school in Sunderland, or the northeast, and another was an economist at Newcastle University, and we decided to put in a bit of money and create this alternative. And it was really sticking our necks out, because everyone said, you're crazy. If you're trying to create an alternative, why don't you go for an academy school? Why don't you go for a free school where you get government funding? I said, I don't want government funding. I want this to be authentically private. And the idea was then we would create the school. We found a building, a church building in Durham, central Durham. Not ideal. We actually preferred parts of Newcastle or Sunderland because it had a bigger market. But anyway, this was the building we found. And we then had parent evenings. The union, this is the NEU now it's called, isn't it? They then started picketing our parent evenings, handing out amazing posh leaflets as if they were, Knight Frank property brochures.
Did you say with the money you spent to print on that, you could have sent your kids here?
It's almost like that, saying how this was a terrible thing, and we would switch off the heating in the winter. You know how cold it is up north. We wouldn't have hot water or heating in the winter. And it was impossible to do anyway. And, how would you trust your children with these people? Actually, on one level, it was incredibly flattering that the union took us seriously. They clearly were worried about us. And Peter Wilby, who wrote an article, a profile in the Guardian newspaper, actually I like Peter Wilby, but it's trying to present me as this ogre. But he said people in state schools should be afraid, very afraid, because this idea will work, he thought.
I think it's good when people attack your personality.
Yeah, it is. It's good as an academic, but actually it was not so good for parents.
Because was it Thatcher that said when they attack you personally, it's because they haven't a single political argument left?
Yeah. Well, in this case, there were political arguments, but they actually thought I was going to succeed. But parents, rightly, their children, they're not going to experiment with their children. So it took us 485 days to get registered. The regulation process was much more difficult than I thought it would be. A lot of our, so we had kept postponing when we were going to open. Our parents, we had about 100 who seemed keen on coming, and then they dwindled. And on the first day we finally opened, having put back the date 3 times, we had 4 students there. And
that's what parents want, though, isn't it? More the ratio of teacher to child.
4 students and 2 teachers.
Yeah.
2 classes. It was an amazing ratio. Anyway, that was a very long introduction, but we have now, in a very small way, but nonetheless, I think it's a small case, but it's actually valid. But the school is now full. The fire reg's only allowed 65, 70 kids. We are now full. We are breaking even financially.
Excellent.
We passed our compulsory Ofsted inspection with flying colours. We got good, which is the best you can as a
I bet they hated signing that off.
Well, they didn't want to. I don't think that. Let's not impute values like this. But one's impression was, certainly one's fear was, they would not want to do that. They would rather have said that we weren't good. But they inspect us, and they sent a very high-powered team around to us. We spent 3 days in the school, and by the end of it, they're just saying, "This is wonderful. This is wonderful." And we have got a price point. It was below £3,000. It's now £3,000 a year, which is 3/5 of the cost in the state schools, and about 1/5 of the cost of the relevant private schools. We have now proven a new market exists now. It's not the poorest, obviously, it's still middle class, but it's affordable by the second lowest quintile of income, and certainly well affordable by the median, which is much, much better than existing private schools. So we have proven there's a market. Now, I've got this job here, I don't have any time to devote there, but I'm very happy for imitators to come in. This is a market now that can move in a disruptive and quick way across the whole of the UK and elsewhere, and America. We've proven the model. So the concept is proven. Now, maybe people can raise big investment, because all this was done on about, well, certainly less than £200,000. So if you ask anyone, we want to create a school, everyone thinks you need millions. It was 170,000, something like that was required. And that was to cover the losses, because we start with...
No wonder they thought you were going to turn the heating off. It's that cheap.
It's incredibly cheap.
That is amazing.
Yeah. So anyone with 200 grand in the bank can start a private school at this rate. But the thing you need really to make this interesting to investors, £200,000 is nothing. If you've got 5 of those schools, then you need £1 million, and then you start making real money. If you've got 10 of those schools, 2 million, and so on. So for an investor, there is a return to be made here. And if you go to our website, IGS Durham, read the parent testimonials. They love this school. We've got great teachers. We have free violin classes. We have free gymnastics, all part of that 3,000 a year.
That's brilliant.
It's a fantastic school, and I do commend people to come. Obviously, to arrange a visit, but come and visit us. It doesn't strike you. You don't go there and think, oh my God, this is really cutting, scrimping, and saving, and I wouldn't send my child there. Most people who go there say, wow, you do this on that amount? I'd certainly send my child here, because the atmosphere is great. The eagerness to learn, the commitment to learn and have fun, all those things are there, and we don't get involved in stuff that maybe other schools have to get involved in.
Independence is what everyone wants, really, isn't it?
Independence, accountability, and we're just one school now, but it will grow. And as I say, I'm here now at the University of Buckingham, so can't focus on that, but nonetheless, other people will focus on it.
Have other investors come to you about doing it in other places and wanting almost to copy your model?
Some have, and I've encouraged them to do it, yeah.
Have any taken off, or are they still in development stages?
Development stage, I think, yeah. I think it will take off. It'll take a while, because, I don't shout about that thing as much as I would like to have done. But the model is proven now. That's the important thing. Totally proven. In a sense, there's no risk, because you can come and see this model for £3,000 a year. You can break even. You can make a surplus with very little investment.
Excellent.
Yeah. So, to summarise, there's this extraordinary market around the world in low-cost private schools. The children go there, outperform those in the government schools. They're affordable to poor parents. It's a wonderful, wonderful grassroots revolution. No one has imposed this. It's just people from the grassroots up are doing this for themselves and for their communities. And I've started something up north which I think demonstrates it can work. Not on the same scale, obviously.
I think it's brilliant you've done it up north, because that kind of almost
shoots
down some other doubters as well.
Yeah. I think it would be much easier to do it down south instead.
Much easier, I think.
Yeah. Salisbury could be a good place, or
quite a bit of money around Salisbury.
Yeah. But anyway, it's an exciting world. I'm now at the University of Buckingham as Vice Chancellor, and some of that excitement about the independent sector I want to rub off here. We are proudly independent, and it's very important that we embrace that.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Callum. Thanks for coming this way.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching the Frankly Speaking podcast. Like and subscribe down below to support the cause. Follow us on our Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, Rumble and YouTube. All links in the link tree down below.